We are ready for our next paper. I hope you had a good break, and after the very invigorating and exhilarating discussion we had earlier, I look forward to hearing Professor Sajjad Rizvi. You are most welcome, and we have your contribution to the new theology. So now we're moving along the discussion towards the contemporary philosophers. Professor Dr. Sajjad Rizvi, we're very happy to have you. You are an associate professor of intellectual history and Islamic studies at the University of Exeter. You are among your current projects is one on the reception of some European philosophies in the post-colonial Muslim context. A project with case studies of Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Pakistan. How very fascinating. I look forward to hearing you. The floor is yours, please.
Well, thank you for the invitation. And, in these contexts, I always give this caveat, which I guess kind of sounds a bit hollow, that I'm a historian. I'm an intellectual historian, not a philosopher. But we'll see how that goes. So I'm going to be presenting on a certain trend that is, it's more broad than the examples I'm going to give, but it's a trend which is about engaging with contemporary thought, using the traditions of Islamic philosophy, in order to produce a new theology which acts as a defense of the faith and acts as a defense of the metaphysical and epistemological postulates as they see it of the faith. And this is particularly in Iran. Now, what do we mean? What's new in a sense in the new theology? So as I mentioned, it's kind of a defensive strategy. It's a defense to comply with modernity and enlightenment. That's, for example, the famous definition that Shibli No'mani gives for Kalam Jadid. I think he's one of the first people to use the phrase. It's very much within the context of modernity, and it's about a certain form of deployment of sources and argumentations. And it, in a sense, demonstrates what one might call a philosophy being deployed for theology. So if one thinks of the famous, cliche about the medieval period, it's philosophy in a sense as the handmaiden of theology, or perhaps as the handmaiden of religion. And it tends to be articulated in vernaculars and in the public sphere. I think that's also quite important, because often the earlier philosophical and even theological traditions tend to be rather rarefied, tend to be rather confined to specialists within a seminary context. Now, going a bit further, one of the classic questions you could ask is, how do we distinguish between philosophy and theology? Why is this, for example, the new theology as opposed to, say, the new philosophy? Or why is this new theology as opposed to sort of new Islamic philosophy? And this is the old kind of argument of kalam versus falsafa. This is the argument about, well, is it about subject matter? Is it about method? Is it about the rhetorical force of a certain work? Is it about the nature of argument versus insistence? Argument versus insistence, for example, brings to mind the classic analytic versus continental philosophy divide. Often people would argue that, well, if you're an analytic philosophy, you tend to argue that analytic philosophy entails analysis of concepts and argument, whereas continental philosophy tends to be repetitive and insisting upon something again and again. Good example of that latter is Levinas, in fact. Or is there something about teleology, the sort of the end goal? And I think these are very open sorts of issues, but I would stress the theology quite simply because of the fundamental approach to the issue, the centrality of God within this. Now, as I mentioned, the term's been around for perhaps over a century or close to a century, And it's been used more generally, as in the case of Shibli, to refer to modernist responses, to responses to colonialist knowledge. I think this colonialist context is important. I'm personally quite interested in decolonial approaches to philosophy. So that's one of the reasons why I'm interested in this sort of topic. There's certain kind of keynotes within the new theology. One is a question of the coherence, the rationality, and the compatibility. And this is all with reference to the coherence, the rationality, and the compatibility of the religious tradition with respect to elements of modern philosophy and modern thought. And it raises the question, I think, of a serious question about what sort of rationalization does the religious tradition require. In this context, we're primarily talking about the Shia intellectual tradition. And in that process, the primary interlocutors for the new Kalam have been these particular thinkers. So Kant, of course, Kant often is used as a representative of European philosophy. Then you have the Marxists, or more broadly, the dialectical materialists. And increasingly, by around the 1960s, 70s, you had the phenomenologists and especially the Heideggerian tradition. Now, to say something a bit more about what they're deploying. So they're deploying primarily a particular philosophical inheritance, which is associated with the Safavid philosopher Mullah Sadra, and the possibility of metaphysics, as well as a theology which is subservient to philosophy. So one of the interesting things which happens in the later period, in the Safavid period, is that broadly theology, and philosophical theology in particular, gets subsumed into philosophy as such. The term for philosophy, of course, being hikmah. And that's significant because you have that sort of bifurcation doesn't necessarily happen in other contexts. So the Kalam tradition, of course, continues amongst the Ottomans and continues in India, but it doesn't continue in exactly the same way in the Safavid context. Now, this philosophical inheritance has certain commitments and certain key ideas within it. Some of these are commitments, but some of these are also argued positions. So one is about the nature of reality, about direct realism. There is literally something outside, beyond my hand, so to speak, if one uses the famous example of Wittgenstein. There is a certain conception of nature, both of human nature as well as nature beyond us. There is an epistemological optimism with respect to the ability to know and understand things. And there is this idea that metaphysics is a foundation for theological discourse and argument, as well as ethics and eschatology. And it's possible to come up with an account of virtue ethics, which is very much grounded in a rational religious approach. And I think quite importantly, one of the things that this tradition also does is that it responds to Ghazali's famous 3 charges against the philosophers by arguing that a theologically oriented philosophy with ethical commitments can actually provide arguments on creation, emanation, on the nature of divine knowledge, and also on the resurrection of bodies, which are the 3 famous positions that Ghazali accused the philosophers of heresy on. Now, this really starts with one important figure, who is Sheikh Muhammad Hussain Isfahani, known as Kumpani as well, who was in Najaf in Iraq. And he famously taught Tabatabai, who we've mentioned. And you can see this approach to the new theology, or the metaphysical foundations of it, in 2 works that he wrote. One is the gloss or the commentary he wrote on Kifayat al-Usul, which at around the turn of the 20th century becomes the most important primer in Usul al-Fiqh in a Shi'i context. And it's relates to how he reworks the work of the Kifaya and separates out issues of metaphysics, language, and procedural instruments, which I guess would more directly relate to questions of ethics. And another work of his, which is known as Tuhfat al-Hakim, which interestingly is a poem of philosophy that he wrote. The edition of that text is not, it's quite a short text. It's about 70 pages of Arabic poetry. And in this, you get the affirmation of realism, you get the necessity of metaphysics, and not just the possibility, but the necessity of it. You do get the epistemological optimism, you get the rationality of moral obligation, and significantly, you get the punchline, so to speak, is the existence of God. So the whole point of arguing out what the role of metaphysics is to establish the reality of God. And then from those, you can then establish metaphysical and moral truths. That becomes an essentially important element of his approach. I'm not going to really talk about this, but just to briefly say something about the text, it has these three parts: a general ontology, which is very much consistent with, followed by a section on categories, which is consistent with the tradition. And then a final theology section, which is primarily concerned with this issue of how we establish the existence of God. And in some ways, it works in a slightly different way to some of the other earlier philosophical theological works, which tended to start with a discussion of philosophical theology, the existence of God, and move on. And this basically reverses the line of logical argumentation. Now, one of the figures who is not sometimes described as being within the new theology, but I think is a very significant person, is Mehdi Haidi Yazdi, the son of the founder of the modern seminary in Qom, famously also a student of Khomeini, although his relationship with Khomeini was somewhat more problematic. And he had studied the Mullah Sadr tradition, and then he went off and studied Kant and analytic philosophy, eventually receiving a PhD at Toronto in 1980 or 81. I think it was 81 actually. And that work has been published. The reason why he's significant is because he's one of the first people who starts teaching philosophy in the new philosophy department in Tehran University after it was established. And he wrote a certain textbooks in metaphysics, which I'll come to in a second, called Ilm Kulli, or physics, or you could even call it first philosophy. And alongside that, he had what I would describe as his Kantian trilogy. So he has a work on the process, the procedures of pure and then of practical intellect. And he also had a work on, which is called the Pyramid of Being, which discusses the, which is sort of an exercise in descriptive metaphysics. But these are works which really are trying to explain what the Mullah Sadr tradition is in the light of a Kantian approach to philosophy, a Kantian systematic approach to philosophy. And in that sense, it's probably one of the most significant elements of that. There's, of course, a much larger tradition of Kant in Iran. And so here I've given you some examples of what's going on in Ilm Kulli, this work on universal science and metaphysics, which was written as a textbook for philosophy students in Tehran University. And of course, interestingly, alongside this, he also wrote an introduction to analytic philosophy, which is also a textbook for those students. So the idea was that we reading these two texts side by side. And this is precisely looking at the way in which philosophy has to be grounded on metaphysics, on direct realism. And it has to be, the method of philosophy has to be located in formal logic and the importance of sound argumentation. Now, when we talk about the new theology, we're usually talking about these two figures. We're usually talking about Sayyid Mohsen Tabatabai, who died in 1981, and his student Murtaza Mutahari, who was killed in a bomb 2 years before that. So as I mentioned, Tabatabai had studied with Isfahani in Najaf, and then moved later ultimately to Qom in 1945 and began teaching theology, and he began teaching philosophy and ethics. There's a certain element of He was also involved in some teaching, mainly informally, in the new theology faculty in the 1950s in Tehran University. So in the 50s, you get the establishment of a dual system for the teaching of philosophy in Iran, which I think is quite significant. So you have philosophy, or what you might call the Mullah Sadr tradition, and Avicenna being taught in the theology faculty. And you have European philosophy, broadly speaking, but it mainly meant the continental tradition, and Kant being taught in the philosophy department in the arts faculty, or in Adabiyat, as it's called. Now, he writes a number of important works. Perhaps the most important in this context is a work which came out of classes that he was informally holding in Tehran in the 50s and 60s, which were then transcribed by his student Mutahari, known as Usul al-Falsafa wa Ravish al-Realism, which basically is the foundations or the principles of philosophy and the realist method. And in that, you precisely have this extension of a discursive, dialectical extension of a defense of a realism and the necessity of metaphysics, as well as a refutation of three things. One is what he calls sophistry, so basically a rejection of the possibility of knowing things and of even affirming that there is a reality beyond my hand, so to speak, and a rejection of idealism, and also a rejection of Marxist dialectical materialism. And this circle, of course, also politically speaking, was quite significant because it intersected with Henri Corbin and Sayyid Hussein Nasser and many others who were also associated with the Pahlavi court, and associated with particular positions such as traditionalism or perennialism. But of course, one of the most interesting things about Tabatabai is the way in which he separates out metaphysics from ethics. And so he has a position in which he distinguishes, he draws upon a much more traditional distinction between haqaiq, of realities, metaphysical truths, if you will, from i'tibarat, which are ideas or positions which are posited, even objects which are posited in the mind, but which have no reference in experimental reality. And he uses this distinction to actually separate out this field of metaphysics and ethics. In effect, what this actually means is that the ethical realm then becomes one which is much more discursive in the public sphere and requires a certain articulation. So ethics is not seen as being derived from metaphysics. He also writes a couple of very important textbooks on philosophy, which follow the pattern of his teacher in Tuhfat al-Hakim, and these become the central textbooks for seminary students in Qom. And they're important because he's precisely trying to train and equip these seminary students with metaphysical principles and approaches, which he thinks will then be of use to them when they go out into the world, when they minister and have a pastoral and intellectual role in their communities, so that they can respond to the ways in which modernity is impacting on people's lives and the challenges that are being brought from that. This is just one example of his proof of the existence of God from the text. And with his student Mutahari, what you find is a move, in a sense, from the theory to the practice. So he has a much more comprehensive approach to metaphysics, morality, and ritual performance. And he's very socially engaged. So Mutahari deals with the classic problems of plurality. How do you deal with diversity and different, or what philosophers would call epistemic peer pressure. And he also writes famously on women's rights and other issues around rights which are being articulated in the Iranian context. And so he's putting forward this idea that the social challenges which are being brought in modern society require a metaphysical response, and that metaphysical response has to be one which is facing both the culturally embedded and physically embodied nature that humans have, whilst retaining the notion of our true noetic and immaterial personhood. More recently, of course, you have these figures who are often placed in Kalam Jadid, or they're sometimes also called the new religious intellectuals, people like Abdul Karim Soroush, Mohsin Kalivat, Mustafa Malikian. And their approach is a far more critical one in many ways with respect to the tradition, and very much drawing upon the philosophy of religion, or particularly fallibilist approaches to the philosophy of religion. Even you could argue with someone like Soroush, he's drawing upon the hermeneutics of suspicion, which of course we are familiar with through Ricoeur, as well as quite a different approach to religion and religious experience. You find Soroush, also another figure, Muhammad Shabastari, I would argue very much drawing upon the insights on religious experience that arise out of certain German Protestant thinkers. I'm thinking particularly of Paul Tillich. In the case of Shabastari, we have some fairly good evidence that he was quite extensively familiar with the work of Tillich. And then finally, this maybe the latest phase of this new theology is one which is articulated much more in the philosophical realm, and this is the ways in which there's been what I would call an analytic turn. So while there are a number of different ways in which new theology works as a response, as a defense of the faith with respect to different challenges, increasingly, one area of this is being articulated purely in analytic philosophy, especially in analytic philosophy of religion, dealing with issues around, how do you establish justification? How do you deal with warrants for belief? How do you deal with the broader process of rationality? How do you deal with the challenges of ambiguity and teleology that and induction that the philosophy of science in particular raises? And once finding this analytic turn in new theology being articulated, particularly in what are sometimes called hybrid institutions, by which I mean ones which are a mix of a seminary and a university-style academic institution, or even in ones which go beyond that. So I would argue that the best example of the analytic turn here, although I think their practitioners would probably deny it, it is amongst the analytic philosophers at what's known as the Institute now of Exact Sciences in northern Tehran, or IPM as it's more popularly called, where you have had, especially in recent times in the last decade, some very significant readings of analytic philosophy, which are not explicit about the way in which they're bringing into conversation with the Islamic tradition, but what is clear in the positions they're putting forward is that there is a defense of the Islamic tradition going on with respect to the possibility of metaphysics, with respect to the analysis of language and concepts, and with respect to how one understands the nature of the human and the intersubjective relationships that humans have.
Thank you very much. I believe we are out of time, but I would encourage everyone to just stick around, join us again in the final section. We will continue the discussion, and we will hope for more participation by the audience then. So for now, I believe it is time for our lunch break. Thank you so much, Professor Rizvi. It was a very fascinating and adequate for the topic discussion that you gave us, and thank you so much for your input.